Hello there, and welcome to the Timeless Historian channel. Tonight, we begin with something fierce and frozen. A time of longships, sagas, and survival against impossible odds. We're diving into what life was really like for Vikings during winter. Forget the horned helmets and Hollywood heroes. The truth? Most Vikings were just trying not to freeze to death in the dark. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. Waking up in a frozen longhouse. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 9th century Norway. It's late December. The good news? You're technically alive. The bad news? Everything else. Your first sensation isn't sight or sound. It's cold, bone deep, unforgiving. Why did my ancestors settle here cold? The kind that makes your teeth ache and your lungs burn with every breath. You're lying on a raised platform bed along the wall of a longhouse, sharing space with roughly 15 other people, 3 dogs, a couple of goats, and what you're pretty sure is a very judgmental chicken perched somewhere in the rafters. The longhouse itself is impressive by Viking standards, which means it's barely adequate by any reasonable measure of human comfort. It's roughly 60 feet long and 15 feet wide, with walls made of timber packed with moss, turf, and desperate optimism. The roof is thatched with reeds and sealed with more turf, and while it mostly keeps the rain and snow out, it definitely doesn't keep the cold out. The inside temperature hovers somewhere between uncomfortably frigid and my breath just turned to ice crystals. Your bed is a wooden platform covered with whatever you could scavenge. Animal hides, wool blankets woven by hand over countless winter nights, maybe some reindeer pelts if you've been lucky in the hunt. Luxury means having enough layers that you can't feel the wooden slats digging into your spine. Reality means waking up with mysterious bruises and wondering if frostbite can happen under 6 layers of wool. The longhouse has one central hearth running down the middle, and right now, in the pre-dawn darkness, it's nothing but dying embers. The fire tender, probably some unlucky thrall or the youngest son who drew the short stick last night, was supposed to keep it going. Clearly he failed, or fell asleep, or died. It's hard to tell in the darkness, and honestly, you're too cold to check. You lie there for a moment, watching your breath form clouds in the darkness, listening to the symphony of medieval sleep, someone snoring like a congested walrus, a baby crying somewhere, a dog's toenails clicking on the packed earth floor, and the constant, relentless wind howling outside like it's personally offended by your survival. Time to get up, not because you want to, but because lying still means getting colder, and getting colder means joining the ancestors sooner than planned. You swing your legs over the edge of the platform and your feet touch the floor. It's earth, packed hard from years of use, covered with fresh rushes that were supposed to provide insulation, but mostly just provide a home for fleas. The cold radiates up through your feet like you've just stepped onto a frozen lake, which, spiritually speaking, you basically have. Around you, the longhouse is starting to stir. Your wife grunts something that might be a greeting or might be a curse. Your 3 children remain motionless, huddled together like a pile of Viking puppies. Smart kids. Your father, grizzled and somehow impervious to cold, is already up, poking at the embers with a stick and muttering about soft young people these days. Welcome to morning in Viking Norway, where every day begins with a choice: get moving or become part of the permafrost. And this is just the beginning. Chapter 2. The morning ritual of not dying. You've managed to stand up without your joints shattering like ice. Achievement unlocked. Now comes the real challenge: getting through the morning without giving up and crawling back under the furs. First priority, revive the fire. In a Viking household during winter, the hearth isn't just the center of the home. It's the difference between life and death. That fire needs to burn day and night, consuming firewood at an alarming rate and producing just enough heat to create a small bubble of survivability in the middle of the longhouse. You shuffle toward the hearth, stepping over a sleeping dog and narrowly avoiding a bucket of something you'd rather not investigate in the dark. Your father has already blown on the embers and added some dry moss and wood shavings. A tiny flame appears and the entire household seems to exhale collectively. Fire equals life. No fire equals becoming a Viking popsicle and providing a cautionary saga for future generations. You add small sticks, then larger pieces, building the fire with practiced efficiency. This isn't your first winter. You know that rushing, it means smoke without flame, and smoke in an enclosed longhouse is its own special torture. The smoke hole in the roof helps, but helps is a generous term. Most of the smoke eventually finds its way out, after thoroughly saturating everything and everyone inside. Your hair smells like smoke, your clothes smell like smoke, your children's children will probably smell like smoke. It's the Viking way. As the fire grows, you can finally see your surroundings. The longhouse is a study in medieval multitasking. Along the walls are sleeping platforms, storage chests, barrels of salted fish, hanging strings of dried meat that look like mummified Viking ancestors, farm tools, weapons, and the loom where your wife and daughters spend countless hours turning raw wool into cloth. The ceiling is blackened from years of smoke, and various tools, herbs, and mysterious objects hang from the rafters like a very functional chandelier of survival. Now, for the next challenge, personal hygiene. And by hygiene, we mean attempting to not be completely disgusting while acknowledging that it's winter and water freezes. Vikings, contrary to popular belief, actually valued cleanliness. They bathed more regularly than many of their European contemporaries, which admittedly isn't saying much. But winter made everything complicated. You can't exactly hop into the fjord for a refreshing morning swim when the fjord is frozen solid, and attempting to do so would result in instant death. Instead, you have options, all of them terrible. Option 1, a bucket of water that was hauled from the well yesterday and has now formed a thin layer of ice on top. You break the ice with your hand, wincing at the cold, and splash your face. The water is so cold it makes your teeth hurt. You scrub quickly with your hands, maybe using some ash from the fire as an abrasive. It works. Sort of. You smell slightly less like sleep sweat and slightly more like wet Viking. Option 2, snow. Some brave souls step outside, grab a handful of snow, and use it to scrub their face and hands. It's cold, it's shocking, and it technically removes dirt while also removing the will to live. But it works, and it saves the precious water supply. Your teeth are next. Vikings didn't have toothbrushes, but they had toothpicks and chew sticks. You grab a frayed twig of birch, carefully preserved for this purpose, and work at your teeth and gums. Some Vikings also used a mixture of ash and herbs to clean their teeth. Does it work? Debatable. Does it give you something to do while the fire builds? Absolutely. Clothing is next. You slept in most of your clothes because undressing in this cold would be suicidal. But you need to layer up. First, your undertunic, made of linen or wool, already on and already smelling like you've been wearing it for 3 weeks because you have. Over that, a wool tunic, thick and heavy. Then wool trousers, wrapped with leg bindings. Wool socks, if you're lucky enough to own them. Leather shoes or boots stuffed with dried grass for insulation. But you're not done. A heavy wool cloak, fastened with a brooch. Maybe a fur vest if you've been successful hunting. A wool hat because half your body heat escapes through your head. And while you don't know the science, you know from experience that covering your head means staying alive longer. Mittens made from sheepskin or fur. And finally, if you're going outside for any length of time, you wrap your face with a wool scarf, leaving just your eyes exposed. You look like a walking pile of textiles. You move like a stuffed sausage. You can barely bend your arms. Perfect. You're ready to face a Norwegian winter. Morning. Around the longhouse, others are going through similar rituals. Your wife is already dressed and working on breakfast. Your father is checking his weapons, even though there's no raiding in winter because the seas are too rough and everyone with sense stays home. Your children are slowly emerging from their fur pile, whining about the cold in that universal language children speak regardless of century or culture. The thralls, the enslaved people who do the hardest work, are already moving about. One is hauling in more firewood from the covered woodpile outside. Another is checking on the livestock in the attached barn area. Their lives are harder than yours, colder, with fewer layers and less food. But everyone's survival is interconnected. If the thralls freeze, there's no one to haul water or tend animals, so they get just enough to survive, which in winter means just barely enough. Outside, through the small gaps in the walls, you can see that it's still dark. Winter. In Norway means the sun rises late and sets early. In the depths of winter, you might get only a few hours of twilight. The rest is darkness, cold, and the constant psychological weight of knowing that spring is months away. But you're up, you're dressed, the fire is burning, you haven't frozen to death yet. In Viking terms, this counts as a successful start to the day. Now comes the hard part. Actually living. Chapter 3. Breakfast in Valhalla. Just kidding, it's porridge. You survived the night. You got dressed without dying. You successfully rekindled the fire. Surely your reward is a hearty, delicious breakfast. A feast worthy of warriors and shield maidens. Right? Wrong. It's porridge. Again, it's always porridge. Viking breakfast during winter is an exercise in making do with what you have, which in December isn't much. The summer's harvest is carefully rationed. Every grain of barley, every dried fish, every preserved vegetable has to last until spring. Waste food in December, and you starve in March. It's simple math with deadly consequences. Your wife and daughters are already preparing the meal. A large iron cauldron hangs over the fire, suspended from a chain. Into it goes water, hauled from the well in buckets and carefully measured. Too much and you waste fuel heating it. Too little and your porridge becomes a gluey disaster. Then comes the grain, barley, oats or rye, ground into coarse flour. It's stirred into the water, forming a thick greyish mixture that bubbles and plops like a miniature volcanic spring. If you're lucky, there are additions. A bit of dried fish, torn into chunks and added for protein. Maybe some dried seaweed, which adds minerals and a vaguely oceanic flavour. If it's been a good year, there might be butter, carefully preserved in barrels or stored in the bog, where the cold and acidity keep it from spoiling. A small pat of butter melting into the porridge is practically a luxury. If you're unlucky, it's plain porridge, just grain and water, seasoned with hunger and desperation. Some families add whatever they can find. Ground dried peas, a handful of nuts saved from autumn, even bark flour made from the inner layer of pine trees. Yes, bark. Because when winter is long and supplies are short, Vikings eat trees. The bark is dried, ground into powder, and mixed with grain flour to make it stretch further. It tastes like wood, because it is wood, but it fills the stomach and provides some nutrition, which is all that matters. The porridge is ladled into wooden bowls. There are no individual servings based on appetite. Everyone gets a portion based on their work requirements. Adult men doing heavy labour get the most. Women working constantly on textile production, cooking and childcare get a solid portion. Children get enough to grow but not enough to waste. The elderly get less, sometimes voluntarily eating smaller portions to ensure the young ones have more. Thralls get the least, often, eating after everyone else has finished, consuming whatever remains. You sit on a bench near the fire, bowl in hand, and eat. The porridge is hot, which is its main virtue. It burns your tongue, but that brief flash of warmth spreading through your chest is worth it. You eat slowly, savouring it, not because it's delicious, but because this might be your only hot meal until evening. There's no lunch, no mid-morning snack. You eat twice a day if you're lucky, once if times are hard. Alongside the porridge, there might be bread, but not the soft, fluffy bread of modern imagination. This is hard, dense, dark bread made from coarse flour and baked into flat rounds. It keeps for weeks without spoiling, which makes it perfect for winter storage. You tear off a chunk and dip it in the porridge, softening it enough to chew without breaking your teeth. For drink, there's water, ale or milk if the cows and goats are still producing. Winter means less fresh milk because animals give less in the cold and dark. The milk you have is precious, often reserved for children. Ale is more common, a weak, slightly sour brew made from barley. It's safer than water, which can carry disease, and it provides calories. Vikings, including children, drink ale throughout the day. Not enough to get drunk, just enough to stay hydrated and alive. Some families have dried fruit, apples, berries preserved in honey or dried into leathery strips. A few pieces of dried apple in winter are a treat, a reminder that summer existed and will exist again. Children fight over these treasures and parents ration them carefully, making them last as long as possible. As you eat, the longhouse fills with the sounds and smells of morning. Smoke curling toward the roof hole, the crackle of fire, quiet conversation in Old Norse, a baby nursing, dogs crunching on bones from last night's meal, the goats bleating from their pen in the attached barn area. It's chaotic, crowded, smelly, and smoky. It's also alive. And in the dead of a Norwegian winter, alive is the goal. Breakfast doesn't last long. There's work to do, always work, and sitting idle means the cold creeps back in. You scrape your bowl clean with your finger and lick it. Wasting even a smear of porridge is unthinkable. Your wife collects the bowls and they'll be rinsed with snow or minimal water later. Soap is for special occasions. Daily dishes get a quick scrub and that's it. You stand, feeling the porridge settle into your stomach like ballast. It's not satisfying in the way a feast is satisfying, but it's fuel. And for a Viking in winter, fuel is everything. Time to work. Chapter 4. The Daily Grind. Literally. Winter work is different from summer work, but it's no less essential. In summer, Vikings farm, fish, trade and raid. In winter, they survive and prepare for the next summer. Every task, no matter how small, serves the ultimate goal, making it to spring without dying. First, the firewood. Always the firewood. The longhouse consumes wood at a terrifying rate. A single day might require several armloads, and that's if you're being efficient. Someone, usually the younger men or thralls, needs to venture outside to the woodpile, a covered structure near the longhouse where logs are stacked high. The wood has been cut and split during autumn, carefully dried and stored. Wet wood makes smoke, not heat. Dry wood is gold. You bundle up, wrapping your cloak tighter, pulling your hood over your woolen hat, and step toward the door. The door itself is a thick wooden slab, hung on iron hinges, with a skin or cloth covering the inside for extra. Insulation. You lift the latch and push. The cold hits you like a physical blow. It's not just cold, it's Norse winter will murder you cold. The kind that makes your eyes water instantly, that sears your lungs, that makes you question every life decision that led you to this frozen wasteland. The wind is howling, driving snow horizontally across the landscape. Visibility is terrible. The sky is a uniform grey, somewhere between night and day, and the sun, if it's up at all, is a weak pale disk barely visible through the clouds. You trudge to the woodpile, each step sinking into snow that might be ankle-deep or thigh-deep, depending on the drifts. Your breath creates clouds of vapour that freeze into tiny ice crystals on your beard and scarf. Your nose runs immediately, and the moisture freezes into uncomfortable little icicles. You grab an armload of logs as much as you can carry and hurry back inside. The contrast is shocking. Outside, frozen hell. Inside, smoky, crowded, comparatively warm salvation. You drop the wood near the hearth and your wife or one of the children stacks it neatly. You'll make several trips throughout the day because the fire cannot, under any circumstances, go out. Next task? The animals. Vikings kept livestock year-round, and in winter, those animals lived in the byre, an attached barn section of the longhouse. Having the animals inside served two purposes. It kept them from freezing to death, and their body heat helped warm the human living area. It's a symbiotic relationship based on mutual survival. You walk to the byre section. The smell hits immediately. It's earthy, pungent, a mix of hay, manure, and animal warmth. You have cows, goats, sheep, maybe a pig or two. They're all clustered together, sharing heat. In summer, they graze freely. In winter, they're your responsibility. Feeding them is first. You take hay from the stored supply, carefully ration to last the winter, and distribute it. The animals crowd around, chewing methodically. You check their water, breaking ice that's formed overnight, ensuring they can drink. Dehydration kills as surely as starvation. Then comes mucking out. Even in winter, animals produce waste, and letting it build up creates disease. You shovel manure into baskets, which will be hauled outside and composted. In spring, this will fertilize the fields. Right now, it's just gross, heavy, and necessary. The The thralls do most of this work, but everyone helps. There's no delegating in winter. Survival is a team sport. While you're working with the animals, you also check for problems. Is that goat limping? Does the cow's breathing sound laboured? Losing an animal in winter means losing milk, meat, and leather. You can't afford casualties. If something seems wrong, you'll consult your wife, who often knows more about animal care than you do, or the local wise woman, who knows herbs and remedies. Back in the main living area, the women and older children are deep into textile work. In Viking society, cloth production is constant, essential work, and winter is prime time for it. Your wife and daughters sit at the loom, a large upright frame where wool is transformed into cloth. They've been working on this same piece for weeks, and it'll take weeks more to finish. The rhythmic clack of the loom, the shuttle passing back and forth, is a constant soundtrack to winter life. But before weaving comes spinning. Massive amounts of spinning. Raw wool, shorn from sheep in summer and cleaned and carded in autumn, must be spun into thread. Your daughters and even your young sons sit with drop spindles, wooden tools that twist the wool fibres into yarn. It's tedious, endless work. One garment might require miles of thread all spun by hand. Children start learning this skill as soon as their fingers can grip a spindle. By age 10, they're competent. By adulthood, it's automatic, something they can do while talking, supervising children, or half asleep. The thread is then dyed, if you have dye materials. Reds from madder root, yellows from plants, blues from woad if you can trade for it. Most cloth is natural wool colours, brown, grey, white, black. But a bit of colour is prized, showing status and skill. As the men handle outdoor work and heavy labour, the women handle what keeps everyone clothed and warm. It's not glamorous, it's repetitive, hard on the hands and back, and absolutely critical. Vikings in inadequate clothing freeze. Well-clothed Vikings survive. The difference is thousands of hours of women's work. You, meanwhile, turn to maintenance tasks. Sharpening tools and weapons. Vikings use axes, knives, spears and swords, all of which need care. A dull axe is dangerous. A rusty blade is useless. You sit by the fire with a whetstone, working on your axe blade with long, practiced strokes. The scraping sound is meditative, and the work is satisfying. Sharp tools mean efficient work. Efficient work means survival. You also repair things. A broken bucket, a cracked tool handle, damaged leather straps. Nothing is thrown away in winter. Everything is repaired, reused or repurposed. You're a Viking. You don't have a hardware store. You have ingenuity, basic materials, and the strong motivation of not wanting to die. Throughout the day, small tasks accumulate, hauling snow to melt for water, checking the roof for damage, reinforcing the door against drafts, making sure the smoke hole isn't blocked, monitoring food supplies, planning how to stretch remaining stores, playing with children, telling stories, maintaining the social bonds that keep a household functional when everyone's trapped inside for months. Lunch doesn't exist. You might grab a piece of dried fish or hard bread if you're hungry, but there's no formal midday meal. You're burning calories constantly, just staying warm and working, but rationing means eating sparingly. As afternoon fades into evening, which happens appallingly early in winter, the work continues. There's always something, and the goal is always the same: survive today so you can face tomorrow. Chapter 5: The Importance of Community, or Why Vikings Didn't Freeze Alone. Here's a thing about Viking winter survival. You don't do it alone, ever. The idea of rugged individualism, the lone Viking against the elements, is romantic nonsense. Vikings survived winter through community, cooperation, and the understanding that your neighbour's survival affects yours. Norwegian settlements weren't isolated farmsteads scattered randomly across the landscape. They were clusters of farms within walking distance of each other, forming communities bound by kinship, trade, and mutual need. In summer, you might go days without seeing your neighbours. In winter, you checked on them regularly because if their fire went out or their food ran low, they became your problem. Villages had informal watchmen, usually older men or women, too frail for heavy work, but still sharp-minded. They kept track of which households had smoke rising from the roof, which children were coughing too much, which families were running low on firewood. Information spread through casual visits, gossip and observation. If someone's chimney went cold, neighbours investigated. Fast. Sharing was survival strategy, not charity. If one family had extra salted fish but was running low on grain, they'd trade with a family in the opposite situation. No one was fully self-sufficient. Everyone had something others needed. This created a web of interdependence that kept communities alive. During the worst storms, when venturing outside meant risking death, families sometimes combined households temporarily. 2 or 3 families would crowd into the largest, best-insulated longhouse, pooling resources, body heat, and labour. It was cramped, loud, and probably smelled horrific. It was also effective. More people meant more body heat, more hands to tend the fire, and more collective vigilance. Children moved freely between households, at least during daylight and safe weather. A child might spend the day at a neighbour's house, learning a skill from another adult, or simply adding their small presence to another family's warmth. This built social bonds and created the flexibility communities needed. If a mother was ill or overwhelmed, other women absorbed her children temporarily. No one was expected to manage alone. The evening gathering, the kveldvaka, was a crucial social institution. After the evening meal, families often visited each other, gathering in one longhouse for company, entertainment, and shared warmth. Stories were told, sagas recited, songs sung, news was exchanged, skills were taught. It was social bonding, education, and entertainment all at once. But it was also practical. Gathering conserved resources. One household's fire heating multiple families meant less overall wood consumption. One lamp lighting a group meant less precious oil, or tallow burned. And psychologically, it kept people sane. Winter isolation could drive people to depression, despair, even madness. Regular social contact was preventive medicine. Skilled craftspeople were community resources. A good blacksmith, even if he was your competitor in summer, was someone you helped keep alive in winter because you might need his skills. A talented healer, usually a woman with knowledge of herbs and midwifery, was protected and supported by the entire community. Her knowledge could mean the difference between a sick child recovering or dying. Religious practices also reinforced community bonds. Winter solstice celebrations, Yule, involved communal feasting, ritual, and renewal. Families contributed what they could to a shared feast. The point wasn't extravagance, but togetherness, a collective defiance of the darkness and cold. "We're still here," the feast said. "Winter hasn't beaten us yet." Storytelling served multiple purposes. Entertainment, yes, but also oral history, moral education, and cultural transmission. During long winter nights, elders told stories of ancestors, gods, heroes, and cautionary tales. Children learned their heritage, their families' deeds, and the expectations of Norse society. But more than that, stories made time pass. They filled the dark hours. They gave people something to think about besides the cold and hunger. Games and contests provided physical and mental stimulation. Vikings played board games like Hnefatafl, a strategy game similar to chess. Children played with carved toys or practiced physical skills indoors. Contests of strength, wit, and skill broke up monotony. Gambling was common, with people betting small items or future favours. It wasn't about getting rich, it was about staying engaged with life. Disputes were still mediated communally. Even in winter, people had conflicts. Someone's goat ate someone else's stored hay. A child broke a neighbour's tool. A debt wasn't paid. These were handled through community meetings, where respected elders heard both sides and rendered judgment. Maintaining social cohesion was too important to let feuds fester. You couldn't afford enemies when everyone's survival was interconnected. The community also monitored vulnerable members. Elderly people living alone, widows without family, orphaned children. These were collective responsibilities. A widow might be assigned help hauling water and firewood, given by rotation among families. An orphan might be informally adopted, or parcelled out to different households for meals. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't always kind, but it was functional. Communities that cared for their vulnerable members had better overall survival rates. Winter also brought death, and communities handled it together. Funerals in winter were grim affairs. The ground was frozen too hard for burial, so bodies were often stored in outbuildings until spring thaw allowed proper burial. But the community still gathered. said words, honoured the dead, and supported the grieving. Death was common enough that everyone understood loss. Shared grief was lighter than solitary mourning. All of this, the sharing, the gathering, the watching over each other, was fundamentally practical. Viking communities that cooperated survived. Those that fractured, where families hoarded and isolated, often didn't make it through winter intact. Natural selection favoured cooperation, and Norse culture evolved to reflect that. So when you picture Vikings surviving winter, don't picture lone warriors. Picture crowded longhouses, interconnected families, children running between homes, shared meals, collective storytelling, and the understanding that no one makes it alone. Your survival depends on your neighbour, and theirs depends on you. That's the Viking way. Chapter 6. Hygiene, Health, and the Horror of Viking Winter Medicine. Let's talk about staying clean and healthy in a time when germ theory was several centuries away, and most medical treatment involved either prayer or plants. Vikings, contrary to medieval European stereotypes, actually cared about hygiene. They bathed regularly, groomed their hair and beards, and even had a dedicated bathing day. Saturday, in Old Norse Lagadagur, literally means washing day. But that's summer behaviour. Winter changes everything. During the coldest months, full bathing becomes a logistical nightmare. You can't exactly fill a tub with water when water is frozen, and heating enough for a bath would consume a day's worth of firewood. So Vikings adapted. They developed what we might call strategic hygiene, focusing on the most important areas while accepting that full body cleanliness would have to wait for spring. The sauna tradition, borrowed from and shared with other Nordic cultures, was a winter lifesaver. Viking communities sometimes had a separate bathhouse, a small structure with a hearth and a platform. Stones were heated until they glowed, then water was thrown on them, creating steam. People sat in the intense heat, sweating out dirt, dead skin, and whatever else accumulated over weeks of layered clothing and minimal washing. This wasn't just cleanliness, it was medicine. The heat killed some parasites, the sweating cleaned pores, and the steam helped with respiratory issues. After the sauna, people sometimes rolled in snow or plunged into an icy stream if they were masochistic enough. The shock was intense, but it invigorated circulation and made you feel intensely, violently alive. Not everyone had access to saunas, though. Rural farmsteads made do with smaller solutions. Wooden basins filled with heated water allowed for washing face, hands, and other critical areas. Vikings used soap, made from animal fat and ash, which was surprisingly effective. They also combed their hair regularly with carved wooden or bone combs, removing lice and tangles. Hair was a source of pride for both men and women, and keeping it clean was a status symbol. But lice were inevitable. Everyone had them. Rich, poor, warrior, thrall. Lice didn't discriminate. The difference was how you managed them. Wealthy Vikings had finer combs and more time for grooming. Poor families just accepted lice as tiny, itchy roommates who never paid rent and constantly threw parties in your hair. Dental hygiene was basic but present. Vikings used chew sticks, frayed twigs of birch or other woods to clean teeth. Some evidence suggests they may have used abrasives like crushed shells or ash to scrub teeth. It wasn't dentistry, but it was something. Still, dental problems were common. Tooth decay, abscesses, and tooth loss plagued Vikings. Once a tooth went bad, your options were extraction, usually done by the local blacksmith or a brave friend with a strong grip, or living with pain until infection killed you. Now, about health. Winter was disease season. Crowded longhouses with poor ventilation, people in close contact, weakened immune systems from limited nutrition. It was a perfect storm for illness. Respiratory infections were common: coughs, chest congestion, pneumonia. Frostbite and hypothermia threatened anyone who spent too much time outside. And then there were the chronic problems: joint pain, arthritis, injuries that never quite healed. Viking medicine was a fascinating blend of practical herbalism and mystical belief. Healers, often women, used plants they knew worked through generations of trial and error. They didn't know why these plants worked, but they knew they did. For fevers and pain, meadowsweet, a plant containing natural salicylic acid, the compound in aspirin. Brewed as a tea, it reduced fever and eased aches. For infected wounds, yarrow, a powerful antimicrobial herb. Crushed and applied to cuts, it helped prevent infection and promoted clotting. For respiratory issues, angelica root, a strong aromatic herb that cleared lungs and fought infection. Vikings also used birch sap in early spring, a tonic full of minerals that helped revitalise bodies depleted by winter. Garlic was a wonder drug. Used both internally and externally, it fought infections, boosted immune function, and was believed to ward off evil spirits, which was bonus protection. Stinging nettle, despite its painful sting, was made into tea that helped with fatigue, blood health, and general vitality. Juniper berries and branches were burned to purify air and treat respiratory problems. For digestive issues, Vikings used a variety of herbs: mint, chamomile, and wormwood for stomach problems. For wounds, honey was applied. Modern science confirms honey's antibacterial properties, but Vikings just knew it worked. Wounds were also sometimes cauterized with hot metal or treated with boiling water to kill infection, but medicine also involved ritual and magic. Healers chanted protective verses, carved runes onto objects, and performed ceremonies to drive out evil spirits thought to cause disease. This wasn't ignorance. It was the best explanation they had for invisible forces, bacteria and viruses, that they couldn't see or understand. And honestly, the psychological comfort of ritual probably helped some patients recover through belief and reduce stress. Childbirth in winter was particularly dangerous. Women gave birth in the longhouse with help from experienced midwives. The fire was stoked high for warmth. Herbs were prepared: mugwort to ease labour, yarrow to control bleeding. But complications were common, and medical intervention was limited. Maternal mortality rates were high. Infant mortality was even higher. Winter births had especially poor survival rates due to cold and limited nutrition, affecting both mother and child. If someone was seriously ill or injured beyond help, Norse culture had a pragmatic, if harsh, approach. Resources couldn't be wasted on the dying when the living needed those resources to survive. Elders sometimes voluntarily reduced their food intake when supplies were low, essentially choosing to starve so children could eat. It was both noble and heartbreaking, a reflection of survival math in a zero-sum environment. Disease outbreaks could devastate communities. If one person in a crowded longhouse caught something contagious, everyone got it. Isolation wasn't really possible when you all lived in one room. Communities tried burning herbs, increasing ventilation despite the cold, and invoking divine protection. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes entire families were wiped out. Vikings also dealt with mental health issues, though they didn't call it that. The long darkness, the isolation, the stress of constant survival. It took a psychological toll. Some people became withdrawn, depressed, or violent. The community tried to manage this through inclusion, distraction, and occasionally restraint if someone became dangerous. There was no formal mental health treatment. You coped, or you didn't. Despite all this, Vikings survived. Their herbalism was effective enough to treat many common ailments. Their hygiene practices, while limited, prevented the worst plagues seen in medieval cities. Their communal living, though disease spreading, also meant constant care and support for the sick. You might lose fingers to frostbite, teeth to decay, or loved ones to disease, but if you made it through winter, you were tougher for it. And there was always next winter to test you again. Chapter 7. Food Preservation and the Art of Not Starving. Let's address the most critical question of Viking winter survival. What did they eat when nothing grows and hunting is brutal? The answer is everything they spent summer and autumn preparing. Vikings were masters of food preservation, turning perishable summer abundance into winter survival rations. Multiple preservation techniques were used, each suited to different foods and resources available. Drying was the most common method. Fish, the backbone of coastal Norse diet, was dried on massive outdoor racks. Cod, herring, and other fish were split, salted lightly, and hung in the cold, dry air. After several weeks, they became hard as wood and could last months or even years. To eat dried fish, you soaked it in water overnight to rehydrate it, then boiled or grilled it. It was nutritious, if not exactly delicious. Meat was also dried. Strips of reindeer, Elk, sheep or cattle were cut thin, salted and hung to dry. This created a preserved meat that could be eaten as is or added to stews. The Vikings also made what we might call early jerky, seasoned meat dried until it was tough and chewy but still edible. Salting was expensive, as salt had to be extracted from seawater or traded for, but it was highly effective. Meat and fish packed in salt barrels could last the entire winter. Salt drew out moisture, preventing bacterial growth. To use salted food, you soaked it to remove excess salt, then cooked it. Everything tasted salty, but you got used to it. Besides, salt was a luxury that proved you were prepared. Smoking combined drying and flavouring. Fish and meat hung in the rafters of the longhouse above the fire, absorbed smoke over weeks. This created a distinctive flavour, helped preserve the food and kept it away from rats and other pests who couldn't reach the ceiling. Every longhouse had strings of smoked food hanging like grim decorations, smelling intensely of fish and wood smoke. Fermentation was another key technique. Skyr, a fermented dairy product similar to yogurt, provided protein and probiotics that helped with digestion. Fermented fish, while horrifying to modern sensibilities, was safe to eat and provided essential nutrients. The fermentation process broke down the fish, creating a pungent but stable food source. Vikings also fermented cabbage and other vegetables when they could get them. Butter and cheese were preserved through a fascinating method, bog burial. Vikings packed butter and cheese in wooden barrels and buried them in cold peat bogs. The acidic, oxygen-free environment and constant cold temperature perfectly preserved dairy products. When needed, they'd dig up a barrel and have freshish butter or cheese. Archaeologists still occasionally find these ancient bog butter deposits, sometimes still technically edible, though no one's volunteering to taste test. Grains were dried and stored in sealed containers, protected from moisture and pests. Barley, oats and rye filled clay pots or wooden barrels. These grains formed the basis of porridge, bread and ale. Protecting grain stores was critical. A rat infestation or mold outbreak could destroy a family's winter food supply. Cats were valued not as pets, but as working animals who kept rodent populations under control. Nuts and berries were dried and stored. Hazelnuts, walnuts and beech nuts could be kept for months in dry conditions. Berries like lingonberries and blueberries were dried or preserved in honey. A handful of dried berries in the dead of winter was a treat that reminded people summer would return. Root vegetables, the few that Vikings had, were stored in underground pits or cool, dark corners of the longhouse. Turnips, onions and carrots could last weeks if kept cold and dry. They weren't exciting, but they were calories, and calories meant survival. Eggs were preserved in several ways. Water glass, a sodium silicate solution, could preserve eggs for months, or they were packed in salt, ash or grain. Winter meant chickens laid fewer eggs, so preserved eggs from autumn had to last. Animal blood was not wasted. Blood sausages and blood puddings used this resource that would otherwise spoil quickly. Mixed with grain and fat, blood became a protein-rich food that kept reasonably well when smoked or dried. Every part of butchered animals was used. Organ meats were eaten fresh or preserved. Bones were boiled for broth, then cracked for marrow. Skin became leather. Horns became tools. Sinews became thread. Nothing was wasted because waste meant death. But preservation wasn't perfect. Food spoiled. Mold grew. Meat turned rancid. Vikings learned to identify safe versus dangerous spoilage. Some foods that smelled bad were still safe to eat after cooking. Others were deadly. This knowledge was passed down and sometimes learned the hard way. Rationing was mathematical and ruthless. Families calculated their stores at the start of winter and divided by the number of days until spring. Daily rations were set and enforced. Running out early meant starvation. Stretching food too thin meant weakness and disease. Getting it right meant survival. The hierarchy of eating continued in winter. Working men got priority. They needed calories to haul wood, tend animals, and do heavy labour. Women got less, though their constant work also burned significant calories. Children got enough to grow, but not excess. The elderly often ate the least, sometimes voluntarily, sacrificing for younger generations. Thralls got scraps and leftovers, just enough to keep them functional. When supplies ran dangerously low, as sometimes happened in extended winters or after a bad harvest, Vikings resorted to emergency foods. Lichen scraped from rocks could be boiled into a nutritious, if unpleasant, porridge. Bark from certain trees, particularly pine, could be dried and ground into flour. Seaweed, always abundant on the coast, became a staple. It was nutritious, free, and practically unlimited, though eating too much caused digestive problems. In the worst situations, people hunted in winter despite the difficulty, tracking animals through snow, using skis to move faster, setting traps for rabbits and other small game. It was dangerous, exhausting work, but sometimes necessary. A successful winter hunt was celebrated because it meant extra rations, a buffer against starvation. The psychological weight of food scarcity can't be overstated. Every meal consumed brought you closer to having nothing. Every child's hungry cry reminded you that supplies were finite. The constant calculation, the daily choices about who eats what, the knowledge that generosity could mean starvation, it created a background stress that permeated everything. But Vikings endured. They counted stores, rationed carefully, shared within communities, and made it through. And when spring finally came, when the first green shoots appeared and fishing became viable again, the relief was overwhelming. They had survived another winter. The cycle would begin again. Chapter 8: Darkness, Isolation, and the Psychological Battle. Here's what Hollywood doesn't show you about Viking winters: the mental toll, the endless, crushing, soul-eroding darkness and isolation that tested minds as harshly as the cold tested bodies. In northern Scandinavia, winter means polar night, periods when the sun doesn't rise at all. Even in southern Norway, winter days are brutally short. You might get 4 hours of weak greyish twilight in late December. The rest is darkness, absolute, cold, relentless darkness. Humans aren't built for this. Our circadian rhythms, our mood regulation, our entire neurological systems expect regular light-dark cycles. Take that away, and things start breaking down. Vikings didn't know about vitamin D deficiency or seasonal affective disorder, but they experienced them acutely. The darkness affected everything. Work efficiency dropped. People became sluggish, depressed, irritable. Fights broke out more frequently over trivial matters. Children cried more. Adults stared into fires, lost in dark thoughts. The term cabin fever didn't exist, but the phenomenon did. Vikings combated this through fire and light. The hearth wasn't just about heat. It was about creating a bubble of light in the darkness, a psychological anchor. Oil lamps and tallow candles provided additional light, though fuel was too precious to burn constantly. Light was rationed like food, adding to the psychological pressure. Social gathering was critical for mental health. The evening kveldvaka wasn't optional entertainment. It was survival strategy. People need interaction, stories, laughter, shared experience. Isolation breeds despair. Community breeds resilience. Vikings understood this instinctively. Storytelling served as both entertainment and therapy. Tales of heroes overcoming impossible odds reminded people they too could endure. Funny stories provided laughter, a psychological release valve. Stories of ancestors who survived previous winters provided hope and connection to something larger than the current suffering. Music helped. Vikings had instruments, lyres, flutes, drums. Singing passed time and elevated mood. Children's songs, work songs, religious chants all served to combat the silence and darkness. Sound was life. Silence was death. Physical activity, even in limited space, was encouraged. Children played, adults practiced fighting skills or wrestled, anything to keep bodies moving and minds engaged. Stagnation led to depression. Movement created purpose, but some people still broke. The sagas mention people going winter mad, becoming violent, delusional, or catatonic. Communities tried to manage this, restraining dangerous individuals, trying to snap withdrawn people back to reality. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and the person died or remained damaged until spring possibly brought recovery. The constant stress of survival created what we'd now recognize as chronic anxiety. Every storm could be the one that destroys your roof. Every cough could be the disease that kills your child. Every dwindling food barrel reminded you that starvation was possible. Living with this constant low-grade terror for months was psychologically exhausting. Sleep was disrupted. The darkness made it hard to maintain regular schedules. People slept more in winter, often in multiple sessions rather than one long sleep. The concept of first sleep and second sleep with a wakeful period in between was common. People woke in the middle of the night, tended the fire, talked quietly, had sex, or just lay awake before sleeping again. It was normal, if not restful. Dreams became more vivid and meaningful. Vikings believed dreams carried messages from gods or ancestors. In winter's darkness, dreams provided escape, entertainment, and sometimes guidance. Dream interpretation was taken seriously. A good dream could improve mood for days. A nightmare could haunt someone through the season. Children struggled particularly with the darkness and confinement. Young bodies need activity. Trapped inside for months, children became restless, loud, and difficult. Parents balanced the need to let children burn energy with the need to maintain peace in a crowded longhouse. It was exhausting for everyone. The elderly faced their own battles. Many knew they might not see another spring. Winter was when the old and weak died most often. Watching yourself or your loved ones decline, knowing that spring might come too late, added a layer of grief to the season. Women bore specific psychological burdens. Pregnant women worried about giving birth in winter's harshness. Mothers watched children go hungry and couldn't fix it. The constant work, weaving, spinning, cooking, cleaning, caring for everyone, continued regardless of their own exhaustion or despair. There was no break, no relief. Men faced pressure to provide and protect, when providing was nearly impossible, and protection meant managing scarce resources. The warrior identity, so central to Norse masculinity, was useless in winter. You couldn't fight the cold or hunger. You could only endure, which felt passive and emasculating. Religion provided some comfort, belief in the gods, in fate, in a larger cosmic order, gave meaning to suffering. Sacrifices and prayers weren't just ritual. They were psychological tools, ways to feel some control over uncontrollable circumstances. If you made offerings to the gods, maybe they'd help, maybe not, but the act itself provided comfort. The promise of spring was everything. People lived for it, talked about it, dreamed of it. Spring meant warmth, light, food, freedom to move outside without dying. It meant survival. Every day that passed was one day closer to spring. People literally counted days, marking time, creating a sense of progress towards salvation. And when spring finally arrived, the psychological relief was as profound as the physical relief. The first extended period of sunlight, the first green shoots, the first fishing trip. These weren't just practical victories. They were emotional salvations. People wept with joy. Children ran outside and screamed with happiness. Communities celebrated with feasts and rituals. They had made it. The darkness hadn't won. Winter tested them, pushed them to psychological breaking points, but they endured. And in enduring, they proved to themselves and their gods that they were worthy of survival, until next winter, when it would all begin again. Chapter 9. Children in the Cold. Let's talk about the smallest Vikings and how they survived winter. Because childhood in Norse society was no gentle, protected time. Children were expected to contribute, endure, and learn from the moment they could walk. Viking children grew up fast. By age 5 or 6, they had assigned chores. Gender roles started early. Boys learned to help with animals, chop kindling, haul water, and practice with child-sized weapons. Girls learned spinning, weaving, cooking, and childcare. These weren't hobbies. They were survival skills everyone needed. In winter, children's labor became even more critical. Small hands could reach into tight spaces to gather dropped grain. Young eyes spotted problems adults might miss. Children hauled light loads of firewood, fetched water, tended fires, and helped with endless textile work. They weren't doing child labor as punishment. They were doing it because everyone's effort was needed. Education happened through observation and participation. There were no schools. Children learned by watching adults and trying to copy them. A 5-year-old girl sat next to her mother at the loom, learning to weave. A 6-year-old boy followed his father to the byre, learning animal care. Mistakes were corrected, but mostly children learned through doing. Stories were education. During long winter nights, children listened to sagas, learning history, moral lessons, and cultural values. They heard about brave ancestors, clever heroes, and foolish villains. These stories taught them what Norse society valued: courage, loyalty, cleverness, and honor. They also learned about gods and the structure of the cosmos, their place in a larger spiritual order. But childhood was also dangerous. Infant mortality was brutal. Roughly a third of Viking children died before age 5. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and exposure killed them. Winter was especially deadly. Babies born in winter had lower survival rates. The cold, the limited nutrition for nursing mothers, the increased disease in crowded conditions, all worked against infant survival. Children who survived infancy faced constant danger, falling into fires, eating contaminated food, drowning in water buckets, freezing to death if they wandered outside. The list of potential deaths was long. Parents tried to protect children, but constant supervision was impossible when everyone was working. Childhood illness was terrifying for parents. A fever, a persistent cough, a strange rash, any of these could be fatal. Parents used herbal remedies, prayers, and magic. Sometimes children recovered, often they didn't. Every family expected to lose at least one child. Some lost all of them. The psychological impact on children of living with constant death and hardship is hard to imagine. They saw siblings die, helped prepare bodies for burial, understood that they too might not survive. This created a certain toughness, but also probably trauma. We can't fully assess from historical distance. Play existed even in winter. Children are resilient and find joy in terrible circumstances. They played with carved wooden toys, dolls made from scraps, simple board games. They wrestled, told each other stories, made up games. This wasn't frivolous. Play helped children process their world, practice adult skills, and maintain psychological health. Older children helped care for younger ones. By age 8 or 9, a child was expected to watch toddlers, freeing adults for other work. This meant children raised children, creating bonds but also adding responsibility. An older sibling might be blamed if a younger one got hurt, adding stress to childhood. Discipline was physical and immediate. A child who endangered themselves or others was struck, not out of cruelty, but as quick correction. There was no time for lengthy explanations when survival was at stake. Obedience was expected and enforced. Still, Viking parents also showed affection, played with children, and told stories specifically to entertain them. Children slept with the family, usually piled together for warmth. Multiple children shared sleeping spaces, creating closeness but no privacy. By modern standards, childhood was cramped, public, and harsh. By Viking standards, it was normal. As children grew, they specialized. A boy showing talent with animals might focus more on herding. A girl with a gift for weaving would spend more time at the loom. By age 12 or 13, children were functionally adults, doing adult work, expected to make adult contributions. Marriage came early, often in mid-teens for girls, late teens, or early 20s for boys. This wasn't childhood marriage. These were young adults by Viking standards, ready to start their own households. They'd been preparing their entire lives. For children who reached adulthood, childhood had been a brutal but effective training program. They learned to work hard, endure discomfort, value community, and survive against odds. The softness modern society allows children didn't exist. Viking children were forged by necessity into tough, capable adults. Or they died young. There was no middle ground. Chapter 10. When Winter Won. Not every Viking story ended with spring's triumphant arrival. Sometimes winter won. Let's talk about the dark reality of Viking winters that ended in tragedy. Bad years happened. A summer with too much rain ruined crops. An early winter caught people unprepared. A harsh autumn meant insufficient food stores. Disease hit at the wrong time. Any combination of these could spell disaster. The Great Famine, though later, illustrates the pattern. Years of bad weather, failed harvests and harsh winters created cascading catastrophes. Food ran out in late winter. People ate seed grain, meaning next year's crop was already doomed. They slaughtered breeding animals, ensuring no future livestock. Desperation bred terrible choices. Starvation has stages. First, you're hungry. Uncomfortably, constantly hungry. You eat less, ration carefully and hope it's enough. Then you're weak. Work becomes difficult. Standing up makes you dizzy. Your body starts consuming itself, burning fat, then muscle. You sleep more, conserving energy. Your mind fogs. Decision-making becomes hard. In the final stages, you stop feeling hungry. This is your body shutting down. You're too weak to work, sometimes too weak to eat, even if food appears. Children's bellies swell from malnutrition. Adults waste away to skeletons. Death comes slowly, then suddenly. Families made impossible choices. Feed the children and let adults starve. Feed the workers and let the elderly die. There were no good answers. Sagas mention elderly people voluntarily walking into the snow to die, reducing mouths to feed. Some stories suggest worse: infanticide, abandonment, even cannibalism in the most extreme situations. Disease often finished what starvation started. Weakened, immune systems couldn't fight infection. Minor illnesses became fatal. Entire families died, one after another. Neighbors found them in spring, frozen in final embraces. Structural failures killed people too. A roof collapsing under heavy snow buried families. A fire accidentally extinguished in the night meant freezing to death. A person venturing out in a storm and getting lost died within sight of home, disoriented by blowing snow. Accidents were often fatal in winter. A broken leg meant immobility, which in winter meant death. An infected wound, normally treatable, became deadly when the patient was already weakened. A childbirth complication had higher mortality rates in winter. Mental health crises led to deaths. People gave up, stopped eating, stopped trying. Depression in winter could be fatal. Others became violent, harming themselves or others. Communities restrained dangerous individuals, but sometimes too late. The psychological trauma of losing family members, especially children, to winter was profound. Parents blamed themselves. Survivors' guilt haunted those who lived when loved ones died. Communities bonded through shared grief, but also fractured under the weight of loss. When spring arrived to find households gone, communities dealt with the aftermath. Bodies were buried. Property was redistributed. Orphans were absorbed into other families. Life continued because it had to, but the scars remained. Some settlements didn't recover. A particularly brutal winter that killed too many people left settlements abandoned. The survivors moved to join other communities. The empty longhouses slowly decayed, becoming cautionary tales. Vikings didn't romanticize winter. They knew it was a killer. Their mythology reflected this. The Fimble winter, the 3-year winter preceding Ragnarok, the end of the world, was based on real fear. The idea that winter could literally end the world wasn't fantasy. It was lived experience. Yet they persisted. Every survivor carried the knowledge that they'd beaten winter. They'd outlasted the darkness, the cold, the hunger. This created a cultural toughness, a collective identity built on endurance. "We survived" became more than a statement. It was a source of pride. The dead were honored in stories. Sagas mentioned those who didn't make it, keeping their memory alive. This served both to honor them and to remind the living. Winter is always waiting. Never get complacent. Never assume you're safe. Chapter 11. Spring at last. After months of darkness, cold, and survival mode, spring's arrival was everything. The psychological shift was as dramatic as the physical change. Let's walk through a Viking spring awakening. The first signs were subtle. Days grew imperceptibly longer. The darkness retreated minute by minute. People noticed, commented, felt hope stirring. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Its light, though still weak, lasted longer. This alone improved moods dramatically. Snow began melting. First from south-facing slopes, then gradually everywhere. Meltwater ran in streams, gurgling and rushing. The sound was beautiful after months of silence. The landscape transformed from white to brown to, eventually, green. Birds returned. Their songs, absent all winter, filled the air. Vikings read the birds, knowing which species arrived when and what their presence meant. Birds meant spring, food, life. Children chased them laughing, just to watch them fly. Ice broke up on rivers and fjords. The loud cracking sounds, the shifting ice floes signalled freedom. Soon, boats could launch. Travel became possible. Fishing could resume. The sea, frozen and hostile for months, became a highway and food source again. The first green shoots appeared, grass pushing through thawing earth, leaves budding on trees, flowers emerging. These weren't just pretty, they were proof. We made it. Winter is over. Life returns. Food became abundant again. Fish runs began. Birds nested, providing eggs. Wild plants emerged, offering fresh greens desperately needed after months of dried, salted, smoked food. The first fresh fish, the first eggs, the first greens. These were feasts, celebrations of survival. Spring work was intense. Fields needed ploughing, seeds needed planting. Everything delayed by winter needed doing immediately. But it was joyful work. Outside, in the light, in the warmth, doing something that created rather than just survived. Animals were let out of the byre. After months confined, they ran, kicked and grazed on fresh grass. Their joy was visible. Milk production increased. Pregnant animals gave birth. The flocks and herds grew, promising future food and wealth. Households emerged. People threw open doors, aired out smoky, stuffy longhouses, cleaned thoroughly. Bedding was washed. Clothing was laundered. The accumulated grime of winter was scrubbed away. It felt like shedding a skin. Bathing became possible. Real bathing, not strategic. Cleaning. People hauled water, heated it, and scrubbed winter off their bodies. They washed hair, cut nails, groomed beards. The transformation was physical and psychological. Social activity exploded. Neighbours visited, sharing stories of winter, comparing who lost what, celebrating survivors. News travelled. You learned who died, who was born, what happened in nearby communities. The isolation ended. Trade resumed. Merchants arrived with goods from distant places. Markets opened. Surplus winter goods were traded for things you needed. The economy, frozen all winter, thawed and flowed again. Religious celebrations marked spring, offerings to gods who'd preserved life, feasts honouring ancestors who'd survived previous winters. These weren't abstract rituals. They were emotional releases, communal gratitude, and collective defiance of winter's threat. Young people courted, marriages were arranged, weddings happened. Spring and summer were times for creating new households, new life. People who'd postponed plans all winter now acted on them. For children, spring was magical. Freedom to play outside, fresh food, parents less stressed. The dark, tense winter atmosphere lifted. They could run, shout, explore without risking death. But spring also brought reckoning. Bodies preserved in storage because the ground was too frozen were finally buried. Grief, postponed by survival necessity, could finally be processed. Communities mourned together, honoured their dead, and then moved forward. Spring also meant raids. Viking men who'd been restless all winter could finally sail. Longships launched, crews assembled, and raiding season began. This brought risk, but also opportunity. Wealth, slaves, honour. The sea called, and Vikings answered. Not everyone saw spring. Those who died in late winter, in the final desperate weeks, never knew spring had arrived. Their families grieved while celebrating survival. It was bittersweet. We made it, but not all of us. The first warm day, truly warm, was celebrated quietly. People sat outside, faces turned toward the sun, soaking in warmth and light. No words necessary, just gratitude, relief, and the simple joy of not being cold. Food stores were assessed. How much remained? More than expected meant a good winter. Less meant you'd cut it close. Either way, new food was coming. you'd survive until next winter. Tools and equipment were repaired. Everything damaged or worn during winter got fixed. You couldn't raid, trade, or farm effectively with broken gear. Spring was preparation time for the active season. As spring progressed into summer, winter became memory. The immediate relief faded into normal life. But Vikings never forgot. Every adult carried scars, physical and psychological, from winters survived. Every elder had stories of harsh years, losses endured, lessons learned. And always, in the back of their minds, next winter is coming. It always comes. And we'll face it again, because we're Vikings. We endure. We survive. We honor our ancestors by living, thriving, and teaching the next generation how to beat the cold, the dark, and the hunger. Winter won battles. Vikings won the war. Year after year, generation after generation, they survived. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Viking Winter Survival. When we look back at Vikings today, we see the raiders, the explorers, the warriors. But their greatest achievement might be something quieter. They survived some of the harshest conditions on Earth, not occasionally, but annually, for centuries. The techniques Vikings developed for winter survival influenced Scandinavian culture for generations. Their food preservation methods, their communal living strategies, their practical clothing adaptations, these weren't lost. They were refined, passed down, and incorporated into Nordic culture that persists today. Modern Scandinavian values of community, self-sufficiency and resilience have roots in Viking necessity. The concept of everyone contributing, of community care, of preparation and planning, these weren't just nice ideas. They were survival strategies that became cultural values. Norse mythology reflects winter's importance. The gods themselves face Fimbulwinter, a 3-year winter that precedes Ragnarok. Even gods fear winter. This wasn't abstract theology. It was cultural trauma encoded in religion. Winter could end the world because Vikings had seen it end individual worlds, families, settlements, entire communities. The sagas preserve stories of winter survival. They're less dramatic than battle tales, but they're there. Stories of families enduring, of clever solutions to frozen problems, of communities pulling together. These stories taught practical lessons disguised as entertainment. Archaeological evidence shows Viking ingenuity. Excavated longhouses reveal insulation techniques, heating systems, food storage solutions. Preserved clothing shows layering strategies. Food remains indicate preservation methods. Vikings were engineers of survival, constantly innovating. The genetic legacy is interesting too. Populations that survived Scandinavian winters likely carried genetic advantages. Perhaps better cold tolerance, more efficient metabolism, resistance to certain diseases. Natural selection was harsh, but survivors passed on traits that helped subsequent generations. Migration patterns were influenced by winter. Vikings who left Scandinavia to settle Iceland, Greenland, or other places took their winter survival knowledge with them. Some places, like Greenland, eventually defeated even Viking tenacity. But their attempts show the confidence their winter survival skills gave them. Modern survival techniques owe debts to Viking methods. Layered clothing, community interdependence, food preservation through multiple methods, the importance of mental health and social bonding in extreme conditions. Vikings knew all this before it became science. Climate change is revealing Viking sites that were frozen for centuries. These sites contain preserved artifacts, food, textiles, even DNA, giving us unprecedented insight into daily life. Ironically, the cold that made Viking life so hard also preserved their legacy. For modern people, Viking winter survival offers lessons. We live in comfort, protected from nature's worst. We've largely defeated winter through technology, but the resilience Vikings demonstrated, their ability to endure, adapt, and maintain humanity in terrible conditions, that's still relevant. Mental health professionals now recognize seasonal affective disorder and recommend the same solutions Vikings used instinctively: light, social interaction, physical activity, community. Vikings were treating sad 1,000 years before we named it. The Viking Age ended, but Viking cultural legacy didn't. Their survival strategies, their values, their stories, these survived. Every time someone in Norway shares resources with neighbours, that's Viking community ethos. Every batch of lutefisk or rakfisk is Viking food preservation. Every winter celebration echoes Viking rituals. For those of us in modern comfort, reading this from heated homes with full refrigerators and electric lights, the Viking winter experience seems unimaginable. And it should. They endured things we can't conceive of enduring, not occasionally as an adventure, but annually as life. They weren't superhuman. They were desperate, cold, often scared, sometimes starving. They lost children, fingers, friends. They suffered, but they also laughed, told stories, made art, raised families, and chose every single day to survive. That's the real Viking legacy. Not the raids or the glory, but the quiet, stubborn refusal to let winter win. The decision to wake up in darkness and cold, to work all day at survival tasks, to share scarce resources, to tell stories in the dark, to believe spring would come, to teach children to endure, and to do it all again the next year. Because what choice did they have? None. And that's the point. They had no choice but to survive, so they did. They developed every technique, every strategy, every cultural practice needed to win the war against winter. And they did win. Their descendants are still here. The bloodline survived. The culture evolved but persisted. The stories were remembered. The sagas were written down. We know their names, their deeds, their gods, their lives. Winter tested them for centuries, and for centuries they passed the test. So the next time you're comfortable in winter, heated and fed and safe, remember, your ancestors, Viking or otherwise, weren't. They fought winter with basic tools, limited resources, and sheer human stubborn endurance. They survived so you could exist. Honor that. Remember that. And maybe appreciate your thermostat a little more. Because those Vikings, they were tough. Tougher than most of us will ever need to be. They survived the coldest nights of the year armed with wool, community, and an unbreakable will to see spring one more time. And that, more than any raid or conquest, is their true glory. Conclusion. The Viking winter dream dies. So how was your day in Viking winter Norway? You woke up in a frozen longhouse, shared space with livestock and 15 relatives, rekindled a fire that kept death at bay, washed with ice water, ate bland porridge, worked constantly at survival tasks, endured psychological darkness, battled disease with herbs and hope, rationed every morsel of food, relied completely on community, and went to bed knowing tomorrow would be exactly the same. For months, still romanticizing the Viking life, still dreaming of horned helmets, longships, and Nordic glory. Because here's the reality. Vikings spent far more time trying not to freeze to death than they ever spent raiding monasteries. The Viking Age we admire, the warriors and explorers, was built on a foundation of brutal winter survival. Every spring raid was possible because someone survived winter. Every settlement, every trade network, every saga was possible because communities endured darkness and cold year after year. Vikings were remarkable, but not because they were invincible, because they were vulnerable humans who refused to give up despite being cold, scared, hungry, and exhausted. They faced conditions that would break most modern people, and they did it without technology, without weather forecasts, without central heating or grocery stores. They survived on ingenuity, community, stubbornness, and the basic human drive to live one more day, see one more spring, tell one more story. So yes, Vikings were badass, but not for the reasons movies show. They were badass because they faced winter, one of humanity's oldest enemies, armed with wool and determination, and they won. Not every time, not without losses, but enough. They won enough to survive as a culture, to pass down their knowledge, to become legends. And now, as you sit in your heated home, full from your refrigerated food, protected from the elements by modern technology, you can appreciate what they did. They lived through what we can barely imagine. They made the cold, dark north habitable. They turned a frozen wasteland into home. That's the real Viking legacy, not conquest, survival. And honestly, that's more impressive. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in comfort, maybe think of a Viking family huddled around a dying fire, telling stories in the dark, sharing their last piece of dried fish, believing in spring even when spring seems impossible. They survived so their descendants could thrive. Honor that by remembering their struggle, their ingenuity, and their unbreakable will. The Viking winter dream isn't about glory, it's about endurance, and they endured. By the gods, they endured. Thanks for joining me tonight on this journey into the frozen heart of Viking survival. If you enjoyed this glimpse into Norse winter reality, consider liking and subscribing, and let me know in the comments. Could you survive a Viking winter? Because I'm pretty sure I couldn't. Until next time, stay warm, stay grateful, and remember, winter is coming. It always comes. The Vikings knew that, and they survived anyway. That's all for tonight. Sleep well.